Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.
WisconsinEye is on the campus of Gateway Technical College in Sturtevant. We're interviewing Nick Polce of Lake Geneva. He's a Republican candidate in the 1st Congressional District. The primary is August 14th. Nick, welcome to WisconsinEye.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
You say on your website that the greatest problem is career politicians.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, if we look at the model of how this country was initially created, it was supposed to be the citizen legislature. So individual will take talents from the private sector, go and work for a few years, and then return back to the private sector. What we've morphed into now is most of these individuals go to Congress to spend a career. And what happens is you're no longer working for who you're supposed to be working for. You're thinking about re-election, and that changes how you act and how you vote.
So how many terms should someone in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate serve?
Well, my vision is six years. So 3 years, 3 terms in the House, 1 term in the Senate. And that 6-year model is not something I pulled out of thin air. I saw it work very effectively in the military. I spent 11 years in the Army and in Special Forces, and it was a model created around leadership. And that 6-year cycle worked very effectively.
You want a congressional pay cut by 33%.
Yes.
A U.S. House member makes $174,000. Why do you think 33% pay cut would make a difference?
Well, I think the being able to actually drop pay is symbolism, quite frankly. And so because you're not going there to spend a career, you shouldn't be going there and have a salary much higher than your private sector individuals. And so you go there, you work for a few years, you earn your salary, you have your health insurance and your retirement, and then when you leave, that's it. You don't get the pension, you don't get any of these extra benefits that we've had for decades now.
So if you were elected, you'd serve 3 terms, 6 years.
Yes, if I earned 3 terms, yes.
And if you were elected in January, what would be the first issue that you'd go to work on?
Spending. Absolutely spending, yes.
Where would you cut?
Well, the problem we have right now, first is the omnibus. The way that we use omnibus bills, it's allowing our elected officials to throw a lot of different fat, pork, whatever you want to call it, together, and then try to ram it through. So where do you start? I start on the discretionary side. And the areas that I would look at in particular would be places like the Department of Energy, the Director of National Intelligence, Department of Homeland Security. Those areas right now is where we would begin on the discretionary side of the House.
Would you get rid of any of those agencies?
Yeah, I'd like to, yes. Yes. So you think about, well, for example, the Department of Energy to begin with, and that was created in the 1970s, and the whole idea behind the Department of Energy was to make us energy independent. Well, that hasn't happened. Now we're in a position because we're able to drill and because we've had a boom in oil and natural gas, we're moving in that direction. So we're making the DOE irrelevant at this point.
Your campaign website says the federal government has grown so large, grown too large, and more often than not gets in the way of progress and freedom. Can you be more explicit?
Sure. As the federal government has grown over the last several decades, we've had a concentration of power in Washington. So more and more money is getting taken out of the private sector. We've had more and more regulations coming out of the regulatory state as the bureaucracy tries to justify itself. So when that's happening now, individuals here in Wisconsin, the 1st District, and states across the country are losing their freedoms.
Okay. Give us some background. You talked about military service.
Sure.
Do you hold any local office? Is this the first time you're running?
Right. This is the first time running for politics. I've spent 11.5 years in the Army, and then after that, we're in a small business for about 4 years. I got a son. He's 20 months old, and my wife, as you said, my little boy, we live in Lake Geneva.
Okay. Thank you. That was the light, right?
Yep.
Okay. Let's talk about one of the major issues. We see it every day. It plays out every day. Immigration reform, DACA, Dreamers. What's your position on those issues, Nick?
So with immigration, the first thing we got to do is start with security, and border security in particular. Because the last time we had any type of comprehensive immigration reform was 1986. We got amnesty. We had about 2 million amnesty. We didn't have any border security. And since that point, we've had another 7 amnesties played out in the last 30+ years. So we have to get the border security to begin with. The second thing is we have to look at some of the laws that are not in American interests. By that I mean you have things like family migration, and that's grown maybe outside the intent of the originally when it was passed in 1965. So we have to restrict that. We get rid of the visa lottery, and then we need to turn our eyes towards some of the laws that don't work for American workers, like, an example, the H-1B visa. And then we don't have, for example, here in Wisconsin, we don't have an immigration law in the books which allows year-round temporary help. There's temporary help in the Southwest for agriculture, but we don't have anything that addresses the year-round needs of the dairy farmers, for example.
What should we do with DACA and Dreamers?
Well, nothing at this point. The first thing we got to do is address the border security and the broken immigration system that we have before we deal with anything related to individuals that have come here illegally. Because DACA was an unconstitutional act by the executive branch back in 2014. And so if we address that before we address border security and the laws that I talked about, we still haven't gotten to the fundamental problem of our immigration system, which is a lack of border security and laws that don't work for American and American workers.
Do you support the president's insistence that we build a wall?
Yes, I do.
You do?
I do.
What about the 12 or 13 million or however many adults that are not here legally? Should there be a path to citizenship for them?
So again, addressing those, I wouldn't do anything with that until we start with the border security and fixing those laws. Because what happens is if we don't, we're going to happen what we had in 1986 and subsequently since then, which is amnesty without having the border security and without fixing the laws.
The president recently said once they cross illegally, they should immediately be sent back to their home countries without any type of due process or action or in the courts or anything. Is that a right response to the crisis?
Well, as individuals that are coming here and crossing our borders illegally, yes, so we need to stop them and decide how it is that what we're going to do with them. So if they're claiming asylum, that's one thing. If they're crossing illegally, that's a different action that we need to be addressing as we're going forward.
You served for 11 years?
Yes, sir.
The Trump administration recently sent Congress a budget for the military, for the Pentagon, that would significantly increase spending, I think, to $700 billion a year.
Yes.
You support that increase? Is it needed?
What we need on the Department of Defense is a little more focus on the costs. Because here's the problem, and I talked about it earlier with the omnibus bill, is that there's a massive increase in spending. We had it under Republican-controlled Congress in 15 and in 18. And we have a spending problem. We have a $21 trillion debt, and we are going to run roughly $1 trillion spending this year. We absolutely have to fund the Department of Defense, but there are areas in the Department of Defense that we can actually look at bringing down. Because when we look at the Department of Defense, we oftentimes compare Department of Defense and military, active duty military. However, you get about 1.3 million active duty soldiers, and you have about 800,000 Department of Defense civilians. And roughly 50% of the Department of Defense's budget is payroll and salary. So there absolutely are areas, because there's layers of fat. We felt them on active duty, and we saw the buildup. There's absolutely areas that you can focus on in the Department of Defense to bring the cost down.
The tax reform bill that passed and the president signed into law, would you have voted for it?
Yes. Yes.
Isn't that one of the reasons that our federal deficit is $21 trillion?
Well, we don't have a tax problem. We have a spending problem. Because if we're going to cut taxes, we have to cut spending. And we didn't do that. So there's two separate issues. If we're going to cut taxes, we can't go ahead and then spend massively like we do with the omnibus bill. So that is the problem. It's not taxing, because if we increase taxes, we're taking more money out of our paychecks. And that's not how it should be, because we best know how to spend our own money. So we have to get our spending under control at the federal government level, which brings me back to originally what we talked about, which is when individuals go to Washington to spend a career, they're no longer thinking about the individual that they're supposed to be representing, which is why we're seeing this massive increase in spending and these ballooning deficits.
The ballooning deficit to the $21 trillion, don't you have to address the three major entitlement programs to get at that? So let's talk about how would you control costs for Medicaid and Medicare?
So we cannot look at Medicare and Medicaid outside the larger healthcare system. Now, Medicare and Medicaid are one of the larger buyers within the United States healthcare system. We can't look at that isolated on its own, because the healthcare system for the last several decades has had more and more intervention from our government, which has caused all kinds of problems. The biggest one right now that we have is we have a third-party payer system. And what that means is that the individual getting the care is disassociated from the actual cost of that care. So we have to address that. If we get that fixed, then those Medicare costs should come down as well. So we can't isolate them. We got to address them at the same time.
You are not saying, though, that we need a universal healthcare system,
no,
are you?
Absolutely not. No.
But you'd wipe out the middle insurance companies that get in the way between the medical provider and the patient?
No, what I would like to see is increased freedom, increased access. So what that would look like now is, first thing we do is we change the tax code. So right now our tax code is set up so that most of us get our insurance through our employer. What that does is it incentivizes the employer to purchase the health insurance, and then the employee essentially gets free money because of the way the tax code is. If we change that, now and you allow individuals that same tax benefit, they will go out and negotiate, they will go out and look on the open market. They also will receive those tax benefits, which give them more control over where they're spending and how they're spending.
The latest projection is that Social Security will be bankrupt potentially by 2034. Now, I notice on your campaign website you say that young people should be able to opt out.
Right.
So tell me how that would work, and would that help solve the looming financial insolvency problem with Social Security?
Sure. So Social Security, the way it's set up right now is that individuals that are working, you and I right now, have their money taken out of the paychecks and it goes to Social Security. That money then gets sent out to the beneficiaries, whether they're disability or their retirement. What is supposed to happen, or how we think the program should be working, is that excess money is supposed to be remaining in Social Security. It hasn't been there. It hasn't been there for decades. That's a problem. So you've had elected officials that for decades have been taking that excess money after the benefits get paid out, sweeping it into the general revenue and spent. And that's why I keep talking and returning back to the spending, because spending is the problem. So we have to stop that. We have to leave that money in the trust fund so that as we are working our way through retirement, what's actually there, we expect will be there. That's the first thing you have to do. Once you get that under control, and once that hole is fixed, then we can look at younger generations, if they want to opt out of it and no longer have any benefits in that, taking that step forward. Because if you think about it, you're looking at about 12.5% each paycheck each year coming out of year. I think you can spend it better than the federal government. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to. I'm not saying we get rid of the system. I'm just saying that we look at increasing access, increasing freedom for the younger generations if they don't want to go down that route.
If a younger person chose not to save anything, that would lead to a financial crisis later in life, right? They wouldn't have any benefits in retirement, would they?
Sure. If we're gonna do individuals that are irresponsible like that, yeah, that would be the worst case scenario. Yes.
Would society then wouldn't they go on Medicaid and be the responsibility of all the taxpayers?
Well, if we're hypothetically talking about changing the current system, a lot more money would be remaining in the private sector. So what you'd expect is more of a charitable model or a private sector model taking care of their own, if that hypothetically was the route that we were going to go.
The other major issue besides immigration this week is the tariffs. Mm-hmm. Do you support the president's tariffs, which have triggered tariffs from the other companies that the president has targeted?
So here's how I see the president, what he's doing is he's using the tariffs as a negotiation tactic. Because what I think he understands, and we talk about it a lot on some of our talks, is that we don't really have a free trade model right now. We have a managed trade with other countries. And managed trade, I mean things like NAFTA, things like your Central American Free Trade Agreement, things like the World Trade Organization, which is a larger body. And those managed trade agreements are thousands of pages long, and they're carve-outs is what they are. So what I think that the president's doing is using tariffs to negotiate so that these trade agreements now can be changed to further benefit American and American workers. So I don't necessarily support tariffs per se as an increased cost of certain goods. What I think the president's doing, though, is using it as a negotiation tactic.
Did you support the president withdrawing the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership?
Yes.
And should the president withdraw us from our trade agreements with Mexico and Canada?
I think at this point we need to look at renegotiating those.
NAFTA,
yes, because you've seen NAFTA since it came in 1995 hasn't necessarily put American and American workers first. And that should be the role of the federal government, is to set the playing field so that individual Americans can prosper.
The President Trump and others in the Trump administration have questioned what climate change and how bad, whether it's a threat to the world. Right. Is it?
Well, climate's going to change. It's going to get hotter and it's going to get colder. What we're talking about specifically is man-made, the charges of man-made climate change. And no, I don't agree with that. I don't see that as being a threat to the world, because the climate changes. And the question I always ask is, what's the perfect temperature? We never hear about what the perfect temperature is. We just always hear it's getting warmer or it's getting colder, without knowing if there's not a perfect temperature. There's nothing to gauge off of.
With the backdrop of school shootings, mass shootings, tragically, do we need to change any of our gun laws?
No, we have laws that work. And in some of the most recent shootings, they've been a failure of government and a failure of bureaucracy. We're not going to end violence by changing our gun laws. And that's both sides, ultimately what our intent and our end state is to end violence. And I don't think you do that by restricting guns. I think you do that by allowing individuals to be able to protect themselves and then enforce the current laws on the books.
When you and I were talking, you said the birth of your son 20 months ago
Yes.
is the reason you're running.
Yes.
Explain that.
Well, it changed my wife and I's lives, as everybody who's a mom or dad, it usually does, right? And so we started looking at the future. And I wasn't happy with the decisions that our elected officials were making. I didn't think that they were putting our interests first. And I judged that off of results. In the last 20 or 30 years, has spending gone down? No. Has healthcare costs gone down? No. Have we secured our borders? No. Have we put trade agreements in place for American workers? No. We talked about Social Security, and then you brought up school security kind of there with the Second Amendment.
Yes.
And we're not fixing these challenges, so we're not preparing the next generation for them to take, much like our parents have prepared us, to take over this great country.
Of those issues, which of them most concern you and why?
Spending. Absolutely spending, because spending reaches a lot of different areas. It domestically creates a lot of debt. It causes problems for our economy. When we have a massive amount of debt, it makes us poor and our kids poor. On national security issues, when you have a foreign government like China, for example, that holds over $1 trillion worth of our sovereign debt, that's a national security issue, because they can use that leverage to potentially manipulate or force us to do or not to do certain things.
What have you learned about the 1st Congressional District now that you've started campaigning in it?
It's a big district and a lot of great people, and there's different issues in different parts of the district. A lot of times you hear the generic question of what's the most important issue, but depending on where we're at and who we're talking to and listening to, there's different issues locally that matter.
The state and local governments are going to provide up to $4.5 billion for Foxconn if
Yes.
Foxconn hits the hiring and development targets. Is that a good deal for the first CD?
I think it's a good deal for the 1st district, and I think it's a good deal for the state as well, because what you expect to happen with a big business like that moving in is that there's going to be a lot of other industries that build up around to supplement. So they bring in those 13,000 jobs, like they said. I think it's a good deal for the district, and it's going to be a good deal for the state.
Okay. Is there any other major issue of your campaign theme that I haven't asked about? Anything else you want to bring up now?
Oh, we talked briefly about the Second Amendment and school security, and I've heard the question a lot on the campaign trail of how do we secure our school? How do we keep our kids safe? And my approach has been different than a lot of my opponents, and it's twofold. The first is that we have to start focusing on our schools as hardened targets, and we got to get access control procedures in place. And what that means is that if an individual does go into a school with a firearm and wanting to do damage, he's limited to where he can go. And so we have to start planning for that. But it can't be something that the federal government comes from a top-down approach. It has to be at the most local level with your school board and with your teachers and with your parents. And the second part of this is we have to look at putting weapons in school, whether it's arming a teacher or it's arming a school resource officer. They have to be trained appropriately.
How did your decision to run, how was it influenced by the decision by the Speaker to not seek a re-election, Mr. Ryan?
It wasn't influenced at all.
Had you announced prior to him?
Yes, we were in the race prior to him resigning, or not retiring. Yes.
Retiring.
Yes.
Final question then, do you want to highlight differences between you and your primary opponents? This is what, a 5-way primary on August 14th?
It is, yes.
I want to give a chance to respond. When I asked Mr. Nalen, he said that you're fairly new to the resident, having fairly recently moved from Virginia. Do you want to respond to that?
Well, he's just inaccurate. We didn't move from Virginia, so he doesn't know his facts. Yes, I am new to the area. Yeah, absolutely. We got up here in October.
Okay.
Yes, that is accurate. I'm new to the area, sure.
Okay. Do you want to highlight other differences between you and the other 4?
Well, I tell you, our main opponent, there's a couple big differences. First, I don't think you go to Congress and spend a career. Our main opponent does. He believes that if you term limit yourself, you're a lame duck. That's his words. As far as spending goes, we are spending way too much money. And I'm not going there to increase spending. We need to cut spending. My opponent doesn't share that view at all. On health care, he wants to continue down the path of repeal and replace. I don't want to go down that route at all. We have way too much government intervention in our healthcare system. And we talked specifically earlier about changing the tax code, of increasing freedom for different folks. So there's really big differences between what we're running on and versus my major opponent.
Okay, thank you. Nick Polce of Lake Geneva is a Republican candidate in the 1st Congressional District. The primary is August 14th. Nick, thanks for talking to WisconsinEye.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.
Pleasure.
Campaign 2018 is sponsored by Wisconsin Hospital Association, Wisconsin Counties Association, Wisconsin Realtors Association, Marshfield Clinic Health System, and Campaign 2018 partner Milwaukee Journal Sentinel.